Hand over that ring, Cassandra. You don't deserve to wear it for another second. My mother-in-law, Vivienne Ashford, stood in the marble hallway of the Riverside County Courthouse, her manicured hand extended toward me with the same imperious gesture she might use to summon a servant. The 3-carat diamond wedding ring on my finger, the one her son had placed there just 3 years ago, suddenly felt heavier than the weight of my failing marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That moment in the courthouse was the culmination of 3 years of systematic psychological warfare, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Because what happened next, when my security detail stepped forward, was something Vivienne Ashford never saw coming. My name is Cassandra Reed, though for 3 tumultuous years I was Cassandra Ashford. I'm 34 years old, and until 6 months ago, I was the CEO of Meridian Tech Solutions, a cybersecurity company I built from nothing into a $50 million enterprise. What most people didn't know, including my now ex-husband, Derek, was that beneath my successful exterior, I'd been living in a carefully constructed prison designed by the most manipulative woman I'd ever encountered. Vivienne Ashford was old money from Beacon Hill, the kind of woman who traced her lineage back to the Mayflower and never let anyone forget it. At 58, she was still striking, with silver hair that never moved and eyes the color of winter storms. She wore her wealth like armor, Chanel suits, Hermes bags, and a collection of jewelry that could fund a small nation's defense budget. But more than her money, Vivienne wielded something far more dangerous: the absolute conviction that she was superior to everyone around her, especially the women who dared to marry her precious sons. From the moment Derek introduced me to his family at their sprawling estate in Millbrook Heights, I knew I was walking into hostile territory. The Ashford mansion sat on 40 acres of manicured perfection, a monument to generational wealth that had been in the family for over a century. Every room was a museum piece, every surface gleamed with the patina of old money, and every family portrait seemed to glare down at me with disapproval. "So, Cassandra," had Vivienne said during that first dinner, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "Derek tells me you're in computers?" She pronounced the word like it left a bad taste in her mouth, as if I'd told her I made a living cleaning sewers. How modern. That should have been my first warning. But I was young, successful, and deeply in love with Derek, who seemed nothing like his mother. He was charming, supportive of my career, and genuinely seemed to admire my independence. What I didn't realize was that Derek was simply the bait in a trap I wouldn't recognize until it was too late. The engagement ring Derek proposed with was a family heirloom, a stunning 3-carat diamond surrounded by sapphires that had belonged to his great-grandmother. When he slipped it onto my finger during a romantic dinner at Les Bernardines, I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Vivienne, however, made it clear that I was merely its temporary custodian. "That ring has been in the Ashford family for 4 generations," she told me the day after Derek proposed, her fingers tracing the velvet box that held the matching wedding band. "I trust you understand the responsibility that comes with wearing it." The wedding itself was a spectacle that belonged more to Vivienne than to Derek and me. She insisted on planning every detail, from the flowers at St. Bartholomew's Cathedral to the reception at the country club where she'd been a member for 30 years. When I suggested incorporating some of my own preferences, she'd smile that cold smile and say, "Of course, dear, but we must maintain certain standards." My own family, my parents, who ran a successful but modest restaurant chain in Portland, and my brother who worked as a teacher, were made to feel like interlopers at my own wedding.
Vivienne seated them at table 12, while her bridge partners occupied the prime spots near the head table. She forgot to include my childhood best friend in the wedding photos, and somehow managed to schedule the rehearsal dinner during my grandmother's memorial service, forcing me to choose between honoring my family's memory and keeping peace with my future mother-in-law. But the ring remained the centerpiece of her obsession. She would comment on how I wore it, suggesting I was too careless with such a precious family heirloom. She'd tell stories at dinner parties about previous Ashford wives who had worn it with such grace and dignity, always with a pointed look in my direction. When I'd take it off to cook or exercise, she'd appear as if summoned, reminding me to put it somewhere safe, where nothing could happen to it.
What I didn't understand then was that Vivienne wasn't just protective of a piece of jewelry. She was establishing ownership, not just of the ring, but of me. In her mind, I was another family asset to be managed and controlled, and the ring was simply the most visible symbol of her authority over my life. The first year of marriage, I tried to win her over. I attended her charity luncheons, participated in her book club, and even let her redecorate our guest bedroom to her specifications. But nothing I did was ever quite right. My career was too demanding, taking time away from family obligations. My clothes were too casual for family events. My friends were too common for Ashford social circles. Derek, caught between his wife and his mother, chose the path of least resistance. He sided with her on everything that mattered while offering me empty apologies in private. "You know how Mother is," became his standard response to every conflict. "Just give her time to adjust." But time only made things worse. Vivienne's criticism became more pointed, her demands more unreasonable, and her attempts to control every aspect of my life more blatant. She expected to be consulted on everything from our vacation plans to my work schedule. And she made it clear that my career was an embarrassing impediment to my duties as an Ashford wife. The breaking point came when she began making decisions about my company without consulting me, using her social connections to interfere with my business relationships. She'd call potential clients and partners, presenting herself as a concerned family member, worried about my ability to balance work and family obligations. Several major contracts fell through after conversations with someone from your family who had raised concerns about my commitment and stability. That's when I realized that Vivienne Ashford wasn't just a difficult mother-in-law. She was a predator who had identified me as a threat to her control over her son and had systematically set about destroying everything that made me independent and strong. The ring on my finger wasn't just a symbol of my marriage. It was a collar, marking me as property of the Ashford family. But Vivienne had made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed that because I had allowed her to push me around for 3 years, I was weak. She had no idea that building a successful company had taught me how to fight battles on multiple fronts, how to plan for contingencies, and how to protect what mattered most. As I stood in that courthouse hallway, looking at her outstretched hand, demanding the return of her ring, I realized this moment had been inevitable. From the day I first walked into the Ashford mansion, Vivienne had spent 3 years systematically dismantling my life, my confidence, and my marriage. Now, she wanted to claim the final trophy of her victory. What she didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for months, and the security detail standing quietly behind me wasn't there for decoration. The game was about to change, and Vivienne Ashford was about to learn what happened when you tried to destroy someone who had spent their entire life building things that were meant to last. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The manipulation didn't start with grand gestures or obvious attacks. Vivienne Ashford was far too sophisticated for such crude tactics. Instead, it began with what seemed like genuine concern, wrapped in the velvet glove of maternal care that masked the iron fist beneath. It started during her honeymoon in Tuscany. Derek and I were staying at a villa his family had rented for the month,
and I thought we'd finally have some time alone to begin our marriage without his mother's constant presence. I was wrong. Vivienne called every morning at exactly 8 a.m. Italian time to check in and share family news that couldn't possibly wait until our return. "Cassandra, darling," she would coo through the international connection, "I hope you're taking proper care of that ring and all that Mediterranean humidity. You know how the climate can affect antique settings." Then she'd launch into detailed instructions on ring maintenance, proper storage, and the insurance policy I needed to review immediately upon our return. When Derek suggested we silence the phone during our honeymoon, I was the one who felt guilty. I told him, "She's just worried about us." I was already falling into the trap she had so carefully constructed. It's sweet that she cares so much, but the calls weren't sweet. They were calculated interruptions designed to remind me, that even on our honeymoon, Vivienne's presence loomed over our marriage. Every romantic breakfast was interrupted by her voice. Every intimate moment was preceded by her checking in to ensure I was properly maintaining her family's precious heirloom. The pattern became clearer once we returned to Boston and moved into the brownstone Derek had purchased in Back Bay. Vivienne had a key, naturally, because family should always have access in case of emergencies. Those emergencies seemed to occur with remarkable frequency, usually when Derek was at work and I was trying to focus on running my company. She'd arrive unannounced with some urgent matter that required immediate attention. The antique chairs in our dining room were too close to the radiator and might warp. The cleaning service I'd hired wasn't suitable for maintaining proper standards in an Ashford residence. The artwork I'd chosen for our bedroom was a bit too contemporary for a home that might host important family gatherings. Each criticism was delivered with a smile and framed as helpful guidance from someone who understood how things are done in their social circle. When I pushed back, suggesting that Derek and I should be able to decorate our own home, she'd look wounded and say, "Of course, dear. I was simply trying to help you avoid any embarrassment when we entertain." The entertaining was another carefully constructed trap. Vivienne insisted that, as the newest Ashford wife, I needed to establish myself properly in their social circle. This meant hosting dinner parties for Derek's business associates, charity luncheons for her various causes, and elaborate holiday celebrations that followed traditions established long before I was born. "It's so important for Derek's career that his wife knows how to manage these things properly," she'd explain while completely restructuring the menu I'd planned or rearranging the seating chart I'd carefully considered. "You wouldn't want to hurt his prospects by being too informal." Every suggestion was presented as education, every criticism as gentle guidance. She was teaching me to be a proper Ashford wife, she explained, just as Derek's grandmother had taught her when she married into the family 30 years ago. It was tradition, it was family, it was love. But love doesn't require you to abandon everything that makes you who you are. The attacks on my independence were subtle at first. Vivienne would schedule family obligations during important business meetings, then act hurt when I chose work over family. She'd invite Derek's colleagues to dinner without consulting me, then criticize my last-minute menu choices when I scrambled to accommodate unexpected guests. "I thought you'd be pleased that I was helping with Derek's networking," she'd say when I confronted her about the surprise dinner parties. "Successful wives understand that their husband's career comes first." My own career, meanwhile, was treated as a charming hobby that I'd eventually outgrow once I understood my real responsibilities. When Meridian Tech Solutions landed a major government contract, the kind of breakthrough that established us as a serious player in the cybersecurity industry, Vivienne's response was to suggest that perhaps it was time to step back and let Derek take a more prominent role in managing things. "You've built something wonderful, dear, but now that you're married, you need to consider what's truly important. Derek needs a wife who can support his ambitions, not someone who's constantly distracted by her own little projects." My little projects employed 200 people and generated $50 million in annual revenue. But pointing this out only made me seem defensive and ungrateful for her guidance. The ring became the focal point of her psychological campaign. She'd comment on how I wore it, suggesting I was too casual with such a precious family artifact. At dinner parties, she'd tell elaborate stories about the previous women who'd worn it. Derek's great-grandmother, who'd worn it while hosting ambassadors and foreign dignitaries, his grandmother, who'd worn it to White House state dinners, his great-aunt, who'd been wearing it while managing the family's charitable foundation. Each story was a reminder that I was merely the current custodian of something that belonged to a legacy I could never truly understand or appreciate. The message was clear. I was temporary, replaceable, a placeholder until someone more suitable came along. Your great-grandmother never removed that ring except for her weekly jewelry cleaning, Derek would tell Vivienne within my hearing. She understood that it represented more than just marriage. It was a symbol of commitment to the family legacy. The implications were obvious. Every time I took the ring off to wash dishes or exercise, I was demonstrating my lack of proper reverence for Ashford traditions. Every time I wore it while working on my laptop or shaking hands at business meetings, I was treating it too casually, exposing it to unnecessary risks. But the ring represented more than family history to Vivienne. It was a leash. As long as I wore it, I was claiming membership in a family that she controlled absolutely. And as long as she could criticize how I wore it, she could maintain her authority over every aspect of my daily life. The criticism extended beyond the ring to everything I did. My clothes were wrong for family events, too businesslike, too contemporary, too attention-seeking. My friends were inappropriate for Ashford's social circles, too career-focused, too diverse, too middle-class. My interests were selfish. Why was I spending time on business networking when I should be supporting Derek's career advancement?
Derek's response to his mother's constant interference was maddening in its consistency. He would listen to my complaints with apparent sympathy, make appropriate soothing noises, and then do absolutely nothing to address the problem. "You know how Mother is," became his universal excuse. "She means well. She's just trying to help you understand how things work in our family." When I pointed out that his mother was undermining my confidence and interfering with my business, he'd suggest I was being too sensitive. When I asked him to set boundaries with her, he'd promise to talk to her when the timing was right. When I demanded that he choose between his wife and his mother, he'd accuse me of being unreasonable and putting him in an impossible position. But the position wasn't impossible. It was just uncomfortable. Derek had spent 31 years learning that the path of least resistance in his family was complete capitulation to his mother's will. Challenging her meant conflict, and conflict meant emotional consequences that he'd been trained from childhood to avoid at all costs. So I found myself fighting a war on two fronts, against a mother-in-law who was systematically dismantling my independence, and against a husband who refused to acknowledge that a war was even taking place. The isolation was perhaps the most insidious part of Vivienne's strategy. She gradually separated me from my support systems, always with perfectly reasonable explanations. Business trips conflicted with family obligations. Girls' nights out were too frequent for a married woman. My friendship with my business partner, Rebecca, was perhaps a bit too close and might give people the wrong impression about my priorities. "I'm not saying you can't maintain your friendships," Vivienne would explain. "I'm simply suggesting that as an Ashford wife, you need to be more selective about how you spend your time and with whom you associate." Every suggestion was framed as protecting my reputation or helping me understand proper social protocols. Every criticism was delivered with a concerned smile and a gentle reminder that she was only trying to help me succeed in my new role. But success in my new role, I was beginning to understand, required the complete erasure of everything I'd been before I married Derek. My business acumen was useful only when it supported Derek's career. My independence was charming only when it didn't interfere with family expectations. My personality was acceptable only when it had been thoroughly filtered through Vivienne's idea of what an Ashford wife should be.
The pattern was clear once I forced myself to see it. Vivienne was systematically destroying everything that made me strong, confident, and independent, while Derek stood by and watched it happen. The ring on my finger wasn't just a symbol of my marriage. It was a collar, marking me as property of a family that would never truly accept me, but would never quite let me go. And the most insidious part was that she'd convinced me to participate in my own diminishment, to accept her guidance and criticism as natural parts of joining a family with higher standards than I'd been raised to understand. But understanding the pattern was only the first step. Escaping it would require something far more dangerous: the willingness to fight back against people who'd spent decades perfecting the art of psychological warfare. By the second year of my marriage, Vivienne's subtle manipulations had evolved into something far more sinister: systematic exploitation of everything I'd worked to build. What I initially dismissed as meddling had become a coordinated campaign to strip away my financial independence, professional reputation, and personal autonomy piece by carefully calculated piece. The first major attack came disguised as family loyalty. Vivienne approached me during one of her unannounced visits, clutching what appeared to be urgent financial documents and wearing her most concerned expression. "Cassandra, darling, I need your help with something rather delicate," she began, settling into my living room as if she owned it. "The Ashford Family Foundation is facing some unexpected tax complications, and our accountants suggest we need to diversify our holdings immediately." She spread the papers across my coffee table with practiced efficiency, pointing to highlighted sections that supposedly showed urgent financial requirements. The foundation, she explained, needed a temporary infusion of capital to avoid devastating penalties that could damage the family's charitable legacy. "Of course, we would never ask you to jeopardize your own business," she continued, "but perhaps Meridian Tech could provide some consulting services or maybe a short-term loan that would benefit everyone involved." The request seemed reasonable on its surface. The Ashford Family Foundation was legitimate, with a long history of supporting education and healthcare initiatives. The tax complications she described were complex enough that I couldn't immediately identify any flaws in her explanation. And the amount she was requesting, $500,000, was significant but not devastating to my company's cash flow. What I didn't realize was that I was being inducted into a carefully orchestrated financial shell game that would entangle my business with Ashford family interests in ways that would become increasingly difficult to unravel.
Within 6 months, that initial loan had spawned a dozen additional financial entanglements. Meridian Tech became the preferred vendor for all Ashford Foundation technology needs, but at rates far below market value because family doesn't gouge family. My company provided pro bono cybersecurity services for Ashford business interests because it was good exposure in the right social circles. I found myself personally guaranteeing loans for family ventures because it would mean so much to Derek to see his wife supporting his family's endeavors. Each request was presented as a temporary favor, a small gesture that would benefit everyone involved. But the temporary favors became permanent obligations, and the small gestures accumulated into substantial financial commitments that drained my company's resources while building Vivienne's influence over my business operations. The true scope of her exploitation became clear when I discovered that she'd been using my company's reputation and my personal connections to advance her own agenda in ways I'd never authorized. She'd contacted potential clients, presenting herself as a representative of Meridian Tech's Family Advisory Board, and had negotiated deals that committed my company to services and pricing structures I'd never agreed to. "I was simply trying to help expand your networking opportunities," she explained when I confronted her about a particularly problematic contract with one of her country club friends. "I thought you'd be grateful for the introduction."
The contract in question committed Meridian Tech to providing comprehensive cybersecurity services for a major retail chain at a price point that would barely cover our costs. But backing out would mean damaging my relationship with a client Vivienne had cultivated through her social connections, potentially burning bridges in Boston's tight-knit business community. More devastating was her systematic interference with my key business relationships. She'd begun hosting elaborate dinner parties where she'd invite my most important clients alongside Derek's business associates, creating an atmosphere where my professional relationships became entangled with Ashford family's social obligations. During these dinners, she'd regale guests with stories about my charming dedication to my little business, always with a tone that suggested my entrepreneurial efforts were an amusing hobby rather than a serious profession. She'd share concerns about how hard I was working, implying that my commitment to my business was putting strain on my marriage and family obligations. Cassandra is so passionate about her work, she'd tell the CEO of one of my largest clients, while I sat helplessly nearby. Sometimes I worry she doesn't leave enough time for the personal relationships that really matter. But that's the challenge of modern marriage, isn't it? Balancing ambition with the traditional values that keep families strong. The message was subtle but unmistakable. I was a woman whose priorities were dangerously out of balance, someone whose business success came at the expense of more important family responsibilities. My clients began treating me differently, offering unsolicited advice about work-life balance, and making pointed comments about the importance of supporting one's husband's career. The financial exploitation extended beyond my business into my personal assets. Vivienne had somehow gained detailed knowledge of my investment portfolio, my real estate holdings, and my personal banking arrangements. She'd offer unsolicited advice about optimizing my financial strategy, always with suggestions that would benefit Ashford family interests. "You're being far too conservative with your investment strategy," she'd lecture during our monthly lunch meetings, appointments she'd unilaterally scheduled and that Derek insisted I attend to maintain family harmony. "The Ashford family has been building wealth for generations. We understand how to make money work properly." Her suggestions always involved shifting my investments towards funds managed by Ashford family advisors, purchasing real estate in areas where the family held significant interests, or restructuring my business ownership in ways that would provide tax advantages while coincidentally giving Derek greater legal authority over my company's operations. When I resisted these suggestions, she'd frame my reluctance as a lack of trust in Derek's judgment or disrespect for his family's financial expertise. "It's almost as if you don't want to be part of this family," she'd say with wounded disappointment. "Successful marriages require shared financial goals and mutual trust." The ring became increasingly central to these financial discussions. She'd reference it as evidence of my commitment to Ashford family values, suggesting that someone who wore such a precious family heirloom should naturally want to align her financial interests with those of her husband's family. That ring represents generations of Ashford women who understood that individual success means nothing without family unity. I hope you'll honor that legacy by making decisions that benefit everyone, not just yourself. But the most insidious aspect of her exploitation was how she'd begun using my success as a weapon against me in social situations. At charity events and family gatherings, she'd introduce me as Derek's wife who runs a little computer business, always with a tone that suggested my professional achievements were somehow embarrassing or inappropriate. "Cassandra is so passionate about her work," she'd tell her bridge club friends, making ambition sound like a character flaw. "Sometimes I think she forgets that the most important job for any woman is supporting her husband's dreams."
She'd share details about my business struggles, information she'd gleaned from the financial documents I'd been pressured to share, with a concerned expression that masked her obvious satisfaction at my difficulties. When Meridian Tech lost a major client due to her interference, she'd commiserate about how challenging the technology sector could be for someone without proper business connections.
Perhaps it's time to consider whether this venture is really sustainable, she'd suggest during family dinners where Derek's relatives hung on her every word. There's no shame in recognizing when something isn't working and focusing on what really matters. What really mattered, according to Vivienne, was my role as Derek's wife and potential mother to the next generation of Ashford heirs. My business was a distraction from these essential functions, a hobby that had grown beyond reasonable proportions and was now threatening my ability to fulfill my true purpose. The exploitation had become so pervasive that I found myself seeking her approval for basic business decisions, second-guessing strategies that had previously made me successful, and accepting financial arrangements that I knew were disadvantageous simply to avoid the emotional consequences of resisting her demands. She'd created a system where my independence was systematically converted into dependence, where my success was reframed as selfishness, and where my resistance to her control was portrayed as disloyalty to my husband and his family. The ring on my finger had become more than a symbol. It was evidence of a contract I'd signed without reading the fine print, committing me not just to Derek, but to a family system that would consume everything I'd built in service of maintaining their control over every aspect of my life. And the most terrifying part was how normal it had all begun to feel. I'd started accepting her interference as the price of family membership, her criticism as well-intentioned guidance, and her exploitation as the natural consequence of joining a family that operated on a different level than I'd previously understood. But understanding the price and being willing to pay it were two very different things. The question was whether I still had enough left of myself to recognize that this wasn't love or family loyalty. It was systematic abuse disguised as traditional values, and it was destroying everything I'd worked my entire life to build. The moment that shattered my carefully constructed denial came on a Tuesday morning in March, during what should have been the most triumphant week of my professional career. Meridian Tech Solutions had just been selected as the primary cybersecurity contractor for the Department of Homeland Security, a $75 million, 3-year deal that would establish us as one of the premier firms in our field. I was in my corner office reviewing the final contract details with my legal team when my assistant knocked urgently on the door. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, her voice tight with confusion, "there's a problem with the DHS contract. Someone from your family called their procurement office this morning." The blood drained from my face as she continued. The caller identified herself as Vivienne Ashford, representing the family's interests in your business operations. She expressed concerns about your work-life balance, your commitment to family obligations, and whether you were taking on more than you could realistically handle given your personal circumstances. The room seemed to tilt around me. For 3 years, I'd convinced myself that Vivienne's interference was annoying, but ultimately harmless. I'd rationalized her meddling as misguided concern, her criticism as outdated social expectations, her financial manipulations as family tradition. But this was sabotage, pure and simple. "Did she say anything else?" I managed to ask. My assistant consulted her notes, clearly uncomfortable. "The caller mentioned that you were trying to start a family soon and that the stress of such a large government contract might be detrimental to your health and your marriage. She suggested they might want to consider whether Meridian Tech was the right choice for such a critical security project." I felt sick. Not only had Vivienne called the Department of Homeland Security to undermine my company's biggest contract, but she'd invented completely fictional plans about Derek and me starting a family. Plans we'd never discussed, plans that existed only in her manipulative imagination. The emergency meeting with DHS was scheduled for that afternoon. I spent the morning preparing damage control strategies, assembling documentation to prove my company's stability and my personal commitment to the project. But how do you defend against attacks that come from within your own family? How do you explain to federal procurement officers that your mother-in-law is systematically sabotaging your business? The meeting was humiliating beyond anything I'd previously experienced. 3 stern-faced officials questioned me about my family situation and whether personal commitments might interfere with my ability to manage such a critical contract. They'd clearly been influenced by Vivienne's carefully crafted concerns, viewing me through the lens of a woman whose priorities were potentially compromised by domestic obligations.
Mrs. Ashford, the lead procurement officer, said, consulting notes that obviously referenced Vivienne's call. We need to understand whether you're truly prepared for the demands of this contract. Government security projects require absolute commitment and reliability. I spent 2 hours defending my professional competence, my company's track record, and my personal dedication to national security. By the end of the meeting, I'd managed to salvage the contract, but the damage to my reputation was undeniable. I was now viewed as someone whose family situation made her a potential liability, someone who required additional scrutiny and supervision. That evening, I confronted Derek about his mother's sabotage. I expected outrage, support, immediate action to prevent any future interference. Instead, I got the same maddeningly passive response I'd received for 3 years. She was probably just trying to help, he said, not even looking up from his laptop. You know how worried she gets about you overworking yourself? Derek, she called the Department of Homeland Security and told them I was planning to get pregnant. She nearly cost us a $75 million contract. Maybe she misunderstood something we said about future plans, he replied with infuriating calm. I'll talk to her about being more careful with her communications. Talk to her about being more careful? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Your mother committed corporate sabotage. She interfered with a federal contract. This isn't about being careful. This is about her deliberately trying to destroy my business. Derek finally looked at me, but his expression was one of annoyed patience rather than support. You're overreacting, Cassandra. Mother would never deliberately try to hurt your business. She's just concerned about your well-being. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the wedding ring on my finger feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. For 3 years, I'd been making excuses for Vivienne's behavior, rationalizing her interference, accepting Derek's refusal to confront the situation. But her call to DHS had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This wasn't family drama or social meddling. This was warfare. And I was losing because I'd been fighting with one hand tied behind my back, trying to preserve family harmony, while Vivienne systematically destroyed everything I'd worked to build. The next morning brought another revelation that left me reeling. My business partner, Rebecca Martinez, arrived at the office with disturbing news about our other major government contract, a cybersecurity project with the Treasury Department. Cassandra, we need to talk, she said, closing my office door behind her. I got a strange call yesterday from Treasury's contracting office. Someone's been asking questions about our company structure, our financial backing, and specifically about your personal involvement in day-to-day operations. My stomach dropped. What kind of questions? They wanted to know if you were planning any major life changes that might affect your role in the company, whether you were considering stepping back from operational responsibilities, whether the company had adequate leadership succession plans in case you became unavailable. Rebecca sat down across from my desk, her expression serious. Cassandra, someone is actively undermining your position with our government clients. This isn't random due diligence. This is targeted sabotage designed to make them question your reliability and commitment.
I told Rebecca about Vivienne's call to DHS, watching her face transform from confusion to outrage to genuine concern for my situation. "This is beyond family drama," she said when I finished. "This is someone with detailed knowledge of your business using that information to systematically damage your professional relationships. How much does your mother-in-law know about our operations?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Over the past 2 years, I'd been sharing financial documents, client information, and strategic plans with Vivienne as part of her supposed efforts to help me optimize my business strategy. I'd given her access to confidential information that she was now weaponizing against me. "She knows everything," I admitted. "Financial records, client lists, contract details, strategic plans. I thought she was trying to help me make better business decisions." Rebecca's expression darkened. "Cassandra, you need to understand what's happening here. Someone with access to your confidential business information is systematically contacting your clients to undermine your credibility. This isn't family interference. This is corporate espionage." That afternoon, I received a call that confirmed my worst fears. James Sullivan, the CEO of Pinnacle Financial, one of our oldest and most important clients, was concerned about rumors he'd heard regarding Meridian Tech's stability and my personal commitment to the business. "Cassandra, I've always valued our relationship, but I'm hearing things that concern me. Questions about whether you're planning major personal changes that might affect your availability. Suggestions that your business priorities might be shifting toward family obligations." I could hear the discomfort in his voice as he continued. "I'm not saying I believe these concerns, but in today's environment, we can't afford any uncertainty about our cybersecurity partners. I need to know that Meridian Tech remains your primary focus."
After I hung up, I sat in my office trying to process the full scope of what Vivienne had accomplished. She'd successfully planted seeds of doubt about my professional commitment with multiple major clients. She created a narrative that portrayed me as a woman whose personal life was becoming incompatible with serious business responsibilities. She'd used my own confidential information to craft targeted attacks designed to destroy my credibility in the industry I'd spent 15 years building. And she'd done it all while maintaining the facade of a concerned mother-in-law who was simply looking out for my best interests and her son's happiness. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my personal attorney, Michael Chen, and scheduled an emergency meeting for the following morning. It was time to stop treating this as a family problem and start treating it as what it really was: a coordinated campaign of professional and personal destruction that required legal intervention. As I prepared for bed that night, I took off the wedding ring for the first time since Derek had placed it on my finger 3 years earlier. I stared at the family heirloom that had become a symbol of my imprisonment, and I realized that wearing it had made me complicit in my own destruction. Tomorrow, I would begin fighting back. But tonight, I mourned the naive woman who'd believed that love and family loyalty would eventually triumph over manipulation and control. That woman was gone, and in her place was someone who finally understood that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones most willing to destroy you to get what they want. Michael Chen's law office occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Boston's financial district, with panoramic views of the harbor that normally would have impressed me. But as I sat across from his mahogany desk the next morning, clutching a thick folder of documents, I was focused on only one thing: understanding exactly how deep Vivienne's sabotage ran and what legal options I had for stopping it. Michael had been my attorney since I'd founded Meridian Tech, handling everything from incorporation documents to major contract negotiations. He'd guided me through the complexities of building a business in the heavily regulated cybersecurity industry, and he'd never seen me look as shaken as I did that morning. "Cassandra," he said, after I'd finished explaining Vivienne's call to DHS and the subsequent client concerns,
What you're describing sounds like a coordinated campaign of business interference. But before we discuss legal options, I need to understand the full scope of what's been happening. Over the next 2 hours, I walked Michael through 3 years of seemingly innocent family interactions that I now recognized as systematic intelligence gathering. Every dinner conversation where Vivienne had asked about my business challenges, every family gathering where she'd encouraged me to share details about upcoming contracts or client relationships, every helpful suggestion that had required me to provide financial documents or strategic plans. She convinced me it was family bonding, I explained, feeling sick as I realized how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. She said successful families share information and coordinate their business interests. I thought she was trying to help me navigate Boston's business community. Michael took detailed notes as I described the gradual escalation of Vivienne's involvement in my business decisions, the seemingly random requests for client contact information in case of emergencies, the suggestions that I introduce her to key business partners at family social events, the insistence that Derek be added to various business accounts and legal documents for estate planning purposes. What started as family support became a comprehensive intelligence operation. She systematically gained access to every aspect of your business operations, then used that information to undermine your relationships with your most important clients. But Michael's investigation revealed that Vivienne's sabotage extended far beyond the government contracts I'd already discovered. He had his firm's research team conduct a comprehensive audit of my business relationships, and what they found was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Over the past 18 months, Vivienne had contacted or attempted to contact nearly every major client in my portfolio. Her approach was always the same: identify herself as a family member concerned about my well-being, express worry about my ability to balance work and family obligations, and plant seeds of doubt about my long-term commitment to their projects. The research team's report detailed a pattern of carefully timed interference that coincided with major business developments. When Meridian Tech was being considered for a significant contract with a major bank, Vivienne had called their security chief to express concerns about my emotional stability during a period when Derek and I were having minor marital disagreements. When we were negotiating a partnership with a Fortune 500 company, she'd reached out to their legal department to question whether I had adequate insurance coverage for potential professional liability claims.
She's been conducting psychological warfare against your business for over a year, Michael explained as we reviewed the documented calls and meetings. Every interaction was designed to make your clients question your reliability, your commitment, or your emotional fitness for managing critical security projects. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Vivienne had been using her social connections to spread rumors about my business practices throughout Boston's tight-knit professional community. At charity events and country club gatherings, she'd expressed concerns about my work-life balance, my dedication to family responsibilities, and my ability to handle the stress of running a growing company. She created a narrative that portrayed you as someone whose personal life was becoming incompatible with serious business responsibilities, Michael's research coordinator explained during our briefing. The message was subtle but consistent. Cassandra Ashford is a woman whose priorities are shifting away from business toward family obligations. The investigation also revealed financial irregularities that I'd somehow missed during my years of trying to maintain family harmony. The loans and consulting arrangements that had entangled Meridian Tech with Ashford family interests were structured in ways that gave Vivienne unprecedented access to my company's financial information, while providing minimal actual benefit to my business. Michael's forensic accountant discovered that the Ashford Family Foundation had used its relationship with Meridian Tech to negotiate favorable deals with other vendors, essentially leveraging my company's reputation to secure discounts for their own projects while providing no compensation to me. They'd presented themselves as representatives of a technology partnership with my company when negotiating contracts, implying a level of business integration that didn't actually exist. She's been using your company's name and reputation to advance her own agenda while simultaneously undermining your business relationships, the forensic accountant explained. It's a sophisticated scheme that generates financial benefits for the Ashford family while weakening your position in the market. But the most shocking discovery came when Michael's team investigated Vivienne's communications with Derek's business associates. They found evidence that she'd been actively working to position Derek as a potential successor to my role at Meridian Tech, discussing his business acumen and natural leadership abilities with people who might influence major contract decisions. She's not just trying to damage your business, she's trying to transfer control of it to Derek. Every conversation where she questioned your commitment or stability was paired with subtle suggestions that your husband might be better positioned to handle the responsibilities of running a cybersecurity firm. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Vivienne had spent 3 years systematically undermining my professional credibility while positioning Derek as a more suitable alternative. She'd used my own business relationships, my confidential information, and my social connections to build a case for why I was no longer fit to run the company I'd built from nothing. Michael recommended hiring a private investigator to document the full extent of Vivienne's interference and to gather evidence that could be used in potential legal proceedings. Within a week, the investigator's report revealed additional layers of manipulation that I never suspected. Vivienne had been monitoring my personal communications, somehow gaining access to my email and text messages through shared family technology accounts that Derek had insisted we establish for convenience. She'd used this information to anticipate my business strategies and to identify potential vulnerabilities she could exploit. She'd also been conducting background checks on my key employees, looking for personal information that could be used to undermine their loyalty or to create internal conflicts within my company. Several of my most trusted staff members had received unexpected calls from business development consultants asking detailed questions about their job satisfaction and their opinions about my leadership style. She's been treating your business like a hostile takeover target, the private investigator explained. Every tactic she's used, intelligence gathering, relationship manipulation, internal sabotage, these are standard corporate warfare techniques adapted for a family situation. The evidence was overwhelming, but Michael warned me that pursuing legal action against family members would be complex and emotionally devastating. Business interference claims are difficult to prove in court, he explained. We have strong evidence of coordinated sabotage, but Vivienne will argue that she was acting out of family concern rather than malicious intent. Derek's complicity will be portrayed as loyalty to his mother rather than betrayal of his wife. However, Michael identified several potential legal strategies that could force Vivienne to stop her interference and potentially recover damages for the business losses her sabotage had caused. We could pursue claims for tortious interference with business relationships, defamation, and conspiracy to damage my professional reputation. More importantly, we could use the threat of legal action to force a confrontation that would expose Vivienne's behavior to the rest of the Ashford family and to Derek himself. Sometimes, Michael explained, the prospect of public legal proceedings was enough to make manipulative family members reconsider their tactics.
But before we proceed with any legal strategy, Michael said as our meeting concluded, you need to decide what outcome you're really seeking. Do you want to repair your marriage and find a way to coexist with Vivienne? Do you want to extract yourself from the Ashford family completely? Or do you want to fight back and show them exactly what happens when they try to destroy someone who knows how to build things that last? As I left Michael's office that afternoon, carrying copies of all the evidence we'd gathered, I realized that I was no longer the naive woman who'd believed that family loyalty would eventually triumph over manipulation and control. I was someone who finally understood the true nature of the war that had been waged against me, and I was prepared to fight back with every weapon at my disposal. The question was no longer whether Vivienne had been sabotaging my business. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was whether I had the strength to do what was necessary to stop her, even if it meant destroying my marriage and my relationship with Derek's family in the process. But as I thought about everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for, and everything Vivienne had tried to take away from me, I realized that some things were worth fighting for, even if the cost was higher than I'd ever imagined paying. Armed with irrefutable evidence of Vivienne's systematic sabotage, I spent the following week developing a comprehensive strategy that would accomplish 3 critical objectives: neutralize her ability to cause further damage to my business, expose her manipulation to Derek and the rest of his family, and position myself to rebuild everything she'd tried to destroy. The first phase required surgical precision in cutting off Vivienne's access to information and influence. Working with Michael Chen and my cybersecurity team, I implemented what we called information quarantine protocols designed to isolate Vivienne from every channel she'd used to gather intelligence about my business operations. I began by conducting a comprehensive audit of every shared account, family technology connection, and cross-linked system that could potentially give her access to my communications. The extent of her digital surveillance was staggering. She'd somehow gained access to my business email through Derek's family iCloud account, my calendar through shared scheduling applications, and even my text messages through a family phone plan that automatically backed up all communications to a central server. She's been operating a sophisticated intelligence network using basic family technology sharing, my IT security director explained as we systematically closed each vulnerability. Every shared account was a potential surveillance gateway, and she'd configured them to give her maximum access while maintaining plausible deniability. Eliminating her digital access required completely restructuring my personal and business technology infrastructure. I changed every password, canceled every shared account, and created entirely new communication channels that were isolated from any Ashford family connections. The process took 3 days and required coordinating with my entire staff to ensure business continuity during the transition. Simultaneously, I began implementing financial firewall protocols designed to untangle Meridian tech from every Ashford family business relationship that Vivienne had orchestrated over the past 3 years. This meant terminating contracts with the Ashford Family Foundation, despite the potential short-term revenue loss, and severing ties with clients who'd been introduced through Vivienne's social connections. Some of these relationships might be salvageable after we've eliminated her influence, my business partner Rebecca advised during our strategy sessions. But right now, every Ashford-connected contract is a potential vector for continued sabotage. The financial restructuring was painful but necessary. We terminated nearly $2 million in annual contracts that had been entangled with Ashford family interests, but the long-term security of my business required eliminating every opportunity for Vivienne to continue her interference. More complex was developing a strategy for neutralizing her social influence within Boston's business community. Vivienne had spent 18 months carefully planting seeds of doubt about my professional competence, and simply stopping her future interference wouldn't repair the damage she had already caused to my reputation. I decided on a proactive approach that would expose her manipulation while simultaneously demonstrating my continued professional strength. Working with a crisis communications specialist, I developed a targeted campaign to systematically contact every client and business partner who'd been subjected to Vivienne's interference. The strategy was delicate but direct. I would schedule face-to-face meetings with each affected client, present them with documentation of Vivienne's unauthorized communications, and demonstrate that her interference was the result of family dysfunction rather than legitimate business concerns. You're essentially conducting a controlled revelation, the communications specialist explained. Instead of letting clients continue to wonder about the rumors they've heard, you're taking control of the narrative by exposing the source of those rumors and proving that they were maliciously motivated. The client meetings were scheduled over a 2-week period, giving me time to prepare customized presentations for each relationship. I compiled evidence of Vivienne's specific communications with each client, paired with documentation of my company's actual performance metrics and stability indicators.
But neutralizing Vivienne's influence was only the first phase of my strategy. The second phase required exposing her manipulation to Derek and his family in a way that would make continued denial impossible. I knew that confronting Derek privately would result in the same dismissive response I'd received after the DHS incident. He'd find ways to rationalize his mother's behavior, minimize the severity of her actions, and avoid taking any meaningful steps to address the situation. Instead, I planned a family intervention that would present the evidence to multiple Ashford family members simultaneously, making it impossible for Vivienne to control the narrative or for Derek to avoid confronting the reality of his mother's actions. The intervention would take place during the family's monthly dinner gathering at the Ashford estate, a tradition that had continued for decades and included Derek's siblings, their spouses, and various extended family members. I would wait until after dinner, when the family traditionally gathered in the library for coffee and conversation, then present my evidence in a format that would be impossible to dismiss or ignore. "You're essentially forcing a public reckoning," Michael Chen observed, as we refined the intervention strategy. "Once you present this evidence to the entire family, Vivienne won't be able to maintain her facade of innocent concern. Derek won't be able to pretend this is just a misunderstanding between you and his mother." The evidence presentation would be structured like a business briefing, complete with documentation, timelines, and clear demonstration of cause and effect relationships between Vivienne's actions and the damage to my business. I would present myself as a professional addressing a business problem, not as an emotional daughter-in-law making accusations based on hurt feelings. But the most crucial element of my strategy was preparing for the inevitable counterattack. Vivienne had spent 3 years perfecting her manipulation techniques, and she wouldn't surrender her position without deploying every psychological weapon in her arsenal. I anticipated that she would try to reframe my evidence as an attack on family unity, portraying me as someone who was prioritizing business interests over family relationships. She would likely claim that her communications with my clients were motivated by genuine concern rather than malicious intent, and she would probably attempt to turn other family members against me by suggesting that I was being vindictive and ungrateful. To counter these predictable tactics, I prepared additional evidence that would demonstrate the calculated nature of her sabotage. The private investigator had documented patterns in her communications that showed clear strategic thinking rather than emotional concern. The timing of her interference consistently coincided with major business opportunities, and her messaging was too sophisticated to be dismissed as well-intentioned meddling. "She's going to try to make this about your character rather than her actions," the crisis communications specialist warned. "You need to stay focused on the documented facts and avoid getting drawn into emotional arguments about family loyalty or personal relationships." I also prepared contingency strategies for various family reactions. If Derek attempted to defend his mother, I had additional evidence that showed his own complicity in some of her schemes. If other family members tried to minimize the situation, I had documentation showing how Vivienne's actions had potentially exposed them to legal liability through their association with the Ashford Family Foundation's questionable business practices. The third phase of my strategy involved positioning myself for post-confrontation success regardless of how the family responded to my revelations. If Derek and his family acknowledged Vivienne's behavior and took steps to address it, I would need clear boundaries and enforcement mechanisms to prevent future interference. If they chose to defend her actions or minimize their significance, I would need to be prepared to completely sever ties with the Ashford family while protecting my business from continued sabotage. This meant preparing legal documents that would formalize any agreements reached during the intervention, including non-interference clauses and financial restitution terms. It also meant developing a comprehensive exit strategy that would allow me to extract myself from all Ashford family relationships while minimizing damage to my business and personal reputation.
You're essentially preparing for every possible outcome, Michael Chen observed as we finalized the strategic documentation. Family reconciliation, partial resolution, or complete warfare. The key is being ready to implement whichever strategy becomes necessary based on their response to your revelations. As the date for the family dinner approached, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For 3 years, I'd been reacting to Vivienne's attacks, trying to defend myself against manipulation I hadn't fully understood. Now, for the first time, I was taking offensive action based on complete information and careful planning. The naive woman who'd believed that love and family loyalty would eventually triumph over manipulation was gone. In her place was someone who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is force people to confront the truth about their actions, even if that truth destroys relationships that were built on lies and control.
Tomorrow night, I would walk into the Ashford family library carrying evidence that would change everything. Whether that change led to healing or warfare would depend on whether Derek and his family had the courage to acknowledge what Vivienne had done and take responsibility for stopping it. The Ashford family's monthly dinner at the estate proceeded exactly as it had for the past 3 years, with one crucial difference. I was no longer the uncertain woman seeking acceptance from people who had never intended to give it. As I sat through the elaborate 7-course meal, watching Vivienne hold court at the head of the massive dining table, I felt the weight of the evidence-filled briefcase beside my chair like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. Derek's brother, Jonathan, and his wife Patricia had driven up from New York for the gathering. His sister Amanda was there with her husband Charles, along with Derek's Uncle William and Aunt Eleanor, who'd been fixtures at these monthly gatherings since before Derek was born. The conversation flowed over topics that had become numbingly familiar: charitable foundation business, country club politics, vacation plans for the family compound in Martha's Vineyard. I participated just enough to avoid appearing rude, but my mind was focused entirely on the presentation I would deliver once we moved to the library. I'd rehearsed every element of the confrontation, anticipated every possible response, and prepared documentation that would make denial impossible. "Cassandra, you're unusually quiet tonight," Vivienne observed during the fish course, her voice carrying that false warmth she deployed when she wanted to draw attention to my supposed inadequacies. "I hope everything is well with your little business." The condescension in her voice, the dismissive reference to my little business, would have stung 3 months ago. Tonight, it felt like confirmation that I was doing exactly the right thing. "Actually, Vivienne, I have some important business matters to discuss with everyone after dinner. I think the family should be aware of some developments that affect all of us." I saw Derek's head snap toward me, his expression suddenly alert with concern. Vivienne's smile faltered almost imperceptibly, but she recovered quickly. "How mysterious," she said with forced lightness. "I do hope it's good news." "It's illuminating news," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "I think everyone will find it very educational." The rest of dinner passed in a tension that only Derek and Vivienne seemed fully aware of. The other family members continued their conversations about summer plans and foundation board meetings, but I noticed Derek pushing food around his plate without eating, and Vivienne's usual commanding presence seemed slightly strained. After dessert and coffee were served in the library, I waited for the staff to withdraw before standing and retrieving my briefcase. The room fell silent as I moved to the center of the space, between the leather sofas where the family had arranged themselves for their traditional post-dinner discussions. "I need to share something with all of you," I began, my voice clear and professional. "Over the past several months, I've discovered that someone has been systematically interfering with my business operations, contacting my clients without authorization, and spreading false information designed to damage my professional reputation." I opened the briefcase and began distributing copies of the documentation Michael Chen's team had compiled: phone records, email transcripts, witness statements, and financial records that painted an undeniable picture of coordinated sabotage.
These documents show that Vivienne has made unauthorized contact with nearly every major client in my portfolio, including sensitive government contractors, private corporations, and financial institutions. I continued maintaining the tone of a business presentation rather than a family confrontation. Uncle William was the first to break the silence, looking up from the documents with genuine shock. Vivienne, what is this about? Did you really call the Department of Homeland Security? Vivienne's composure cracked slightly, but she recovered with practiced skill. I was concerned about Cassandra's well-being, she said, her voice taking on that wounded tone she always used when challenged. She's been working such long hours, and I worried that she was taking on more than she could handle. According to this transcript, Jonathan said, studying the DHS documentation, you told them she was planning to start a family and might not be able to fulfill her contractual obligations. Is that true? Derek was staring at the documents in his hands with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of horror and dawning understanding that suggested he was finally grasping the scope of his mother's actions. These conversations weren't expressions of concern, I said, moving to the timeline I'd prepared that showed the strategic nature of Vivienne's interference. They were carefully timed to coincide with major business opportunities and contained specific false information designed to make my clients question my reliability and commitment. I walked them through the pattern methodically. The bank contract sabotage with calls about my emotional stability, the Fortune 500 partnership undermined with questions about insurance liability, the Treasury Department project compromised with concerns about succession planning.
This isn't family concern, I concluded. This is corporate espionage conducted by someone with intimate access to my business information and personal life. Vivienne's face had gone pale, but she rallied with the skill of someone who'd spent decades manipulating family dynamics. I refuse to sit here and be attacked by someone who's clearly under tremendous stress, she said, rising from her chair with imperial dignity. I've done nothing but try to help Cassandra understand the responsibilities that come with being part of this family. Sit down, Mother, Derek said quietly, his voice carrying an authority I'd never heard him use with her before. I want to hear all of this. The surprise in Vivienne's face was almost worth 3 years of manipulation. Derek had never contradicted her publicly, never questioned her authority, never taken anyone's side against hers. But the evidence spread across the coffee table was apparently too overwhelming for even his practiced denial. I continued with the financial documentation, showing how Vivienne had used her access to my business information to benefit Ashford family interests while simultaneously undermining my market position. The room grew increasingly quiet as I detailed the sophisticated nature of her scheme, the leveraging of my company's reputation, the positioning of Derek as a potential successor, the systematic isolation of my support networks. The total financial damage, I said, presenting the forensic accountant's summary, approaches $3.2 million in lost contracts, damaged relationships, and diverted opportunities. This doesn't include the ongoing reputation damage that will take years to fully repair. Amanda was the first family member to speak directly to the scope of what I'd revealed. Vivienne, is this true? Did you really conduct this kind of systematic campaign against Cassandra's business? I was protecting this family's interests, Vivienne replied, abandoning any pretense of innocent concern. Cassandra's priorities have always been wrong. She's never understood what it means to be an Ashford wife, and her obsession with her career has been damaging Derek's prospects and our family's reputation. The mask was finally off. No more gentle guidance or maternal concern. Just the naked truth about her motivations and objectives. So you decided to destroy her business? Charles asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. You thought sabotaging her clients and spreading false information was protecting the family? I was trying to help her understand reality. Vivienne shot back. Women like Cassandra need to learn that there are more important things than personal ambition. Derek needs a wife who supports his career, not someone who competes with him. Derek stood abruptly, his face flushed with an anger I'd never seen him display toward his mother. You called the Department of Homeland Security and told them my wife was pregnant.
You've been monitoring her communications and sabotaging her business relationships for 3 years? I was protecting you, Vivienne said, but her voice had lost its commanding certainty. She was never right for this family, Derek. I was simply helping you see that before it was too late. Too late for what? Derek's voice was rising now, years of suppressed frustration finally breaking through his careful control. Too late for you to completely control my life? Too late for me to have a marriage that wasn't subject to your approval? I watched this exchange with fascination and a growing sense of vindication. Derek was finally seeing his mother clearly, finally understanding the choice he'd avoided making for 3 years. The question now, I said, regaining control of the room, is what happens next? I have legal grounds to pursue criminal charges for business interference, harassment, and possibly conspiracy. I also have grounds for civil litigation that could result in significant financial penalties. I paused, letting the legal implications settle over the room. But before I make any decisions about legal action, I want to give this family an opportunity to address the situation internally. Vivienne was staring at me with undisguised hatred now, her carefully constructed facade completely abandoned. "You wouldn't dare," she said. "I absolutely would," I replied with calm certainty. "And given the evidence I've compiled, I'm confident about the outcome. The question is whether you prefer to resolve this as a family matter or as a legal matter." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Everyone was staring at Vivienne, waiting for her response. And for the first time in 3 years, she didn't have an immediate answer that would allow her to maintain control of the situation. The confrontation I'd planned so carefully had accomplished its primary objective, exposing Vivienne's manipulation to the entire family in a way that made denial impossible. Now, we would discover whether the Ashford family had the courage to acknowledge the truth and take responsibility for stopping the woman who had nearly destroyed me in service of her own psychological needs. The silence in the library stretched for what felt like an eternity before Vivienne finally spoke, her voice stripped of its usual commanding authority. "You're making a terrible mistake, Cassandra. This family has standards, traditions, ways of doing things that you've never understood. If you pursue this vendetta, you will destroy everything."
"I'm not destroying anything," I replied calmly. "I'm simply refusing to allow you to continue destroying me." I turned to address the rest of the family, who were still processing the magnitude of what they'd learned. "I need to know where each of you stands. Are you going to continue enabling this behavior, or are you going to help me ensure it stops permanently?" Derek was the first to respond, his voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "Mother, how could you do this? How could you systematically sabotage my wife's business and then lie to my face about it for 3 years?" "I was protecting this family's reputation," Vivienne shot back, but her usual confidence was cracking. "She never belonged here, Derek. She's too ambitious, too independent, too focused on her own success to be a proper Ashford wife." "A proper Ashford wife?" Amanda interjected, her voice sharp with incredulous anger. "You mean someone you can control completely? Someone who has no identity or achievements outside of what you approve?" I watched with satisfaction as the family dynamics that had protected Vivienne for decades began to crumble. Her children and in-laws were finally seeing her clearly, understanding that her family protection was actually systematic control and manipulation. Uncle William was studying the financial documents with growing alarm. "Vivienne, do you understand what you've exposed this family to legally? If Cassandra pursues criminal charges for business interference, the foundation could be implicated. All of our charitable activities, our tax-exempt status, our board relationships, everything could be jeopardized." "I never intended for things to go this far," Vivienne said, and for the first time, I heard uncertainty in her voice. "I was simply trying to guide Cassandra toward more appropriate priorities. By calling federal agencies and lying about her personal life, By spreading false information to her business clients? By monitoring her communications and sabotaging her contracts? This isn't guidance, Mother. This is criminal harassment. I let the family process the implications for several minutes before presenting the next phase of my strategy. I'm prepared to offer the family one opportunity to resolve this matter without involving law enforcement or civil litigation, but my terms are non-negotiable. I opened a second folder and distributed copies of the agreement Michael Chen had drafted. These are the conditions under which I'm willing to handle this as a family matter rather than a legal matter. The document outlined comprehensive restrictions on Vivienne's behavior going forward, complete prohibition on contacting any of my business associates, clients, or professional contacts, requirement to send written retractions to every person she'd contacted with false information about my business, surrender of all access to any shared accounts or systems that could provide information about my activities, and payment of $500,000 in damages for the documented business losses her interference had caused. "You can't be serious," Vivienne breathed, staring at the document. "This is extortion." "No," I replied firmly. "Extortion is what you've been doing to me for 3 years, using threats and manipulation to control my behavior. This is accountability. These are the consequences of your choices." Patricia was reading through the agreement with her lawyer's eye for detail. "These terms seem reasonable given the documented damages," she said quietly. "The financial penalty is actually less than what you might face in civil court, and the behavioral restrictions are basic boundaries that should have existed all along." Derek was staring at his mother with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but genuine disgust. "You're going to sign this," he told her. "You're going to make this right, or I'm done with you completely." "Derek, you can't mean that," Vivienne said, reaching toward him with a desperation I'd never witnessed from her before. "I'm your mother. Everything I did was for your benefit." "Everything you did was for your own benefit. Your need to control everyone and everything around you. I've spent my entire adult life making excuses for your behavior, but this," he gestured toward the evidence spread across the coffee table, "this is unforgivable." The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. For decades, Vivienne had maintained control through emotional manipulation, family guilt, and the threat of social consequences for anyone who opposed her. Now, faced with documented evidence of her systematic sabotage and the united opposition of her own family, she was experiencing the isolation and powerlessness she'd spent years inflicting on me. "I need time to consider this," she said finally, her voice small and uncertain. "You have 24 hours. If you haven't signed the agreement by tomorrow evening, I'll be filing criminal complaints on Monday morning." The family meeting dissolved into smaller conversations as relatives discussed the implications of what they'd learned. I noticed several of them approaching Derek to express their shock and support, while others examined the evidence more closely to understand the full scope of Vivienne's actions. Charles pulled me aside as the gathering was breaking up. "Cassandra, I want you to know that Patricia and I had no idea this was happening. If we'd known Vivienne was interfering with your business, we would have spoken up immediately."
"I appreciate that," I replied. "But the question now is whether the family is willing to hold her accountable going forward. This can't happen again." "It won't," he assured me. "What she did crosses every line of acceptable behavior. The fact that she did it systematically over 3 years makes it even worse." As Derek and I drove home that night, the silence between us was heavy with unspoken recriminations and the weight of revelations that had fundamentally altered our marriage. Finally, Derek broke the quiet. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so incredibly sorry for not protecting you from her. I knew she was difficult, but I never imagined she was capable of this level of manipulation and sabotage. You didn't just fail to protect me, you actively enabled her. Every time I tried to tell you what was happening, you dismissed my concerns. Every time I asked you to set boundaries with her, you told me I was being unreasonable.
You chose her comfort over my well-being for 3 years." Derek was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he gripped the steering wheel. I know I failed you completely. I was so conditioned to avoid conflict with her that I couldn't see what she was doing to you, to us. The question, I said, is what you're prepared to do now. Because this isn't over, Derek. Your mother isn't going to simply accept defeat and move on. She's going to fight back. And when she does, you're going to have to choose, definitively and publicly, between supporting me or protecting her. I choose you, he said immediately. After seeing what she's done, after understanding how thoroughly I failed as your husband, I choose you. Whatever it takes to make this right, whatever boundaries need to be set with my family, I'm ready to do it. I wanted to believe him, but 3 years of betrayal had taught me to value actions over words. We'll see, I said simply. The next 24 hours would test whether the Ashford family was capable of holding Vivienne accountable for her actions, or whether they would rally around her and force me to pursue the legal remedies Michael Chen had prepared. Either way, I was no longer the powerless victim of her manipulation. For the first time in 3 years, Vivienne was the one experiencing consequences, uncertainty, and the threat of losing everything she'd worked to build. The woman who had systematically destroyed my professional relationships was now facing the prospect of public exposure and legal consequences that could destroy her own social standing and family relationships. The role reversal was complete, and I intended to make the most of it. Whether through family accountability or legal action, Vivienne Ashford was about to learn what happened when someone with resources and determination decided to fight back against years of systematic abuse. The naive woman who had believed that family loyalty would eventually triumph over manipulation was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that sometimes the most effective form of justice is simply forcing people to experience the consequences of their own actions. The 24 hours passed without any communication from Vivienne, which told me everything I needed to know about her intentions. She was gambling that I wouldn't follow through on my threats, betting that family pressure and Derek's intervention would convince me to accept some watered-down compromise that allowed her to maintain face while avoiding real consequences. She had fundamentally misunderstood who I had become. Monday morning, I walked into Michael Chen's office with the determination that surprised even me. File everything, I told him, without preamble. Criminal complaints, civil litigation, restraining orders, the full legal arsenal. Vivienne Ashford chose to ignore my final offer, so now she gets to experience the consequences of that choice. Michael had anticipated this outcome and had spent the weekend preparing a comprehensive legal strategy that would hit Vivienne from multiple angles simultaneously. We're filing criminal complaints for business interference, harassment, and conspiracy, he explained, as we reviewed the documentation one final time. The civil suit will seek damages for the full $3.2 million in documented losses, plus punitive damages for the intentional nature of her conduct. But the real devastation would come from the public nature of the legal proceedings. Vivienne's reputation in Boston's elite social circles was built on decades of carefully cultivated image management. Criminal charges and civil litigation would expose her behavior to exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd spent her life avoiding. The criminal charges will be public record immediately. The civil suit will include depositions from her society friends, business associates, and family members. Every detail of her manipulation and sabotage will become part of the court record. I felt a cold satisfaction as I signed the paperwork that would destroy Vivienne's carefully constructed world just as thoroughly as she'd tried to destroy mine. The woman who had used social pressure and reputation management as weapons was about to discover what happened when those same forces turned against her. The first indication that Vivienne understood the magnitude of her miscalculation came at 2:30 that afternoon when Derek called me in a panic. Cassandra, you have to stop this, he pleaded. Mother's been arrested. There are reporters at the house. The foundation board is meeting in emergency session. This is destroying everything. Good, I replied calmly. That's exactly what I intended. But the family businesses, our reputation, the charitable work, all of it is going to be damaged by this scandal. Then perhaps your family should have thought about those consequences before enabling Vivienne's behavior for decades, I said. Actions have consequences, Derek. I'm simply ensuring that she finally faces hers. The criminal proceedings moved faster than I'd anticipated. Within 48 hours, local news outlets had picked up the story of a prominent Boston socialite arrested for systematic business interference and harassment. The details that emerged in the initial court filings painted a picture of sophisticated corporate sabotage that shocked even seasoned business reporters. Ashford family matriarch charged with corporate espionage read the headline in the Boston Business Journal. The article detailed Vivienne's calls to federal agencies, her interference with major contracts, and her systematic campaign to damage my professional reputation. But the most devastating coverage came from the society pages, where Vivienne's former friends and social allies began distancing themselves from her with remarkable speed. The same women who had attended her charity luncheons and bridge games were now giving quotes to reporters about their shock and concern about her behavior. I had no idea Vivienne was capable of such calculating cruelty, Eleanor Hartwick told the Society reporter from the Boston Globe. To systematically sabotage her own daughter-in-law's business while pretending to be a concerned family member, it's sociopathic behavior disguised as maternal concern. The Ashford Foundation Board held their emergency meeting on Wednesday, and by Friday, they had voted unanimously to remove Vivienne from all leadership positions and to launch an independent investigation into whether Foundation resources had been used to support her sabotage campaign. The Foundation cannot be associated with behavior that violates the ethical standards we've maintained for over 50 years, Board Chairman Harrison Whitfield announced in a carefully worded press statement. We are committed to full cooperation with law enforcement and to ensuring that our charitable mission is not compromised by personal misconduct. The social consequences were swift and merciless. The country club where Vivienne had been a member for 30 years launched a disciplinary review that would likely result in her membership being revoked. The Museum of Fine Arts removed her from their board of trustees, pending the outcome of legal proceedings. 3 different charitable organizations announced that they were returning donations associated with her name. Derek was caught in the crossfire of his mother's destruction, forced to choose between supporting his wife's legal action and defending his family's rapidly disintegrating reputation. The pressure from his siblings and extended family was intense. They blamed me for the scandal that was destroying their social standing and business relationships. You could have handled this privately, Amanda accused during a tense phone call. Did you really need to destroy our entire family's reputation to make your point? Your family's reputation was built on enabling and protecting someone who systematically abused people. If exposing that abuse destroys your reputation, maybe the reputation wasn't worth protecting in the first place. The civil litigation revealed additional layers of Vivienne's manipulation that even I hadn't suspected. During the discovery process, Michael's team uncovered evidence that she had been planning her campaign against me since before Derek and I were married. Emails recovered from her personal computer showed that she had researched my business background, identified potential vulnerabilities in my client relationships, and developed strategies for undermining my professional credibility months before our wedding. She had converted her marriage to Derek as a hostile takeover, viewing me as a threat to be neutralized rather than a daughter-in-law to be welcomed. She created files on your key employees, your major clients, and your business partners, Michael explained as we reviewed the recovered evidence. She treated your marriage to Derek as an intelligence operation, gathering information she could use to control or destroy you if you didn't conform to her expectations.
The most devastating revelation came from her communications with a private investigator she had hired to conduct surveillance on my activities. For over a year, she had been paying someone to monitor my movements, photograph my meetings with clients, and document my daily routine. This goes beyond harassment into stalking territory, the prosecutor assigned to her criminal case explained during one of our preparation meetings. The systematic nature of her surveillance and sabotage demonstrates clear criminal intent rather than family dysfunction. The breaking point for Derek's family came when depositions revealed that Vivienne had been manipulating them as well, using information she gathered about their own business activities and personal relationships to maintain control over family dynamics. Jonathan discovered that she had been monitoring his divorce proceedings and using confidential information to pressure him about alimony decisions. Amanda learned that Vivienne had interfered with her adoption application by sharing concerns about her parenting abilities with the adoption agency.
She wasn't just targeting you, Derek told me after attending his brother's deposition. She was manipulating all of us, using whatever information she could gather to control our decisions and maintain her position as the family power broker. The realization that they had all been victims of Vivienne's systematic manipulation finally united Derek's siblings in support of my legal action. Instead of pressuring me to drop the charges, they began providing additional evidence of her controlling behavior and sharing their own experiences of manipulation and coercion. "We should have seen this years ago," Patricia admitted during a family meeting that took place without Vivienne for the first time in decades. The way she controlled every family decision, monitored everyone's activities, and punished anyone who didn't conform to her expectations, it was systematic abuse disguised as family leadership. By the end of the month, Vivienne's world had collapsed completely. She was facing multiple felony charges that could result in prison time. Her civil trial would expose decades of manipulation to public scrutiny. Her social standing had been destroyed beyond repair. Her own family had turned against her and was providing evidence to support my case. Most importantly, she had lost the power to hurt me or anyone else in the family. The systems she had used to gather information and influence decisions had been dismantled. The relationships she had leveraged to spread rumors and create problems had been severed. The fear that had kept her victims silent had been replaced with anger that fueled their cooperation with investigators. The woman who had spent 3 years systematically destroying my life was now experiencing the complete annihilation of her own carefully constructed existence. And unlike her attacks on me, which had been hidden behind facades of family concern, her destruction was playing out in full public view, providing a cautionary tale about the consequences of systematic abuse and manipulation. The role reversal was complete, but more than that, justice was finally being served. Not just for me, but for Derek and his siblings who were finally free from decades of manipulation and control. The family could begin healing once the source of toxicity had been permanently removed from their lives. The months following Vivienne's legal downfall became a proving ground for everyone involved. Derek had to demonstrate whether his promises of change were genuine. His siblings had to learn how to function as a family without their mother's toxic control. And I had to decide whether the relationships damaged by years of manipulation could be rebuilt on healthier foundations. Derek's transformation was the most immediately apparent and the most crucial for our marriage's survival. For the first time in his adult life, he was making decisions without seeking his mother's approval or anticipating her emotional reactions. The change was profound and sometimes painful to watch as he grappled with decades of conditioned responses. "I don't know who I am without her voice in my head," he admitted during one of our weekly marriage counseling sessions with Dr. Sarah Brennan. "Every major decision I've ever made was either to please her or to avoid her disapproval. I'm 34 years old and I'm just now learning to think for myself." The therapy sessions revealed the depth of Vivienne's psychological control over her children. She had systematically undermined their confidence, isolated them from independent support systems, and created a family dynamic where her approval was the primary source of self-worth and security. "What your mother created was a form of institutional abuse," Dr. Brennan explained during a particularly difficult session. She used intermittent reinforcement, alternating punishment and reward, to maintain psychological control over all of you. breaking free from that conditioning requires consistent effort and often feels like betraying fundamental aspects of your identity. Derek's journey toward independence wasn't smooth. There were moments when the pressure of family disapproval or the weight of social consequences made him waver in his support for my legal action against his mother. Old patterns of conflict avoidance would resurface, and he'd suggest that maybe we could find some compromise that would end the public scandal. "She's going to prison, Derek," I would remind him during these moments of backsliding. "She committed serious crimes against me, against you, and against your siblings. There's no compromise that erases that reality." But gradually, Derek began to understand that his mother's imprisonment wasn't a tragedy. It was the natural consequence of choices she'd made repeatedly over many years. More importantly, he began to see that protecting me from her abuse was his responsibility as my husband, regardless of the social or family costs. The real test came when Vivienne's sentencing hearing approached. She had eventually accepted a plea agreement that would result in 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. The prosecutor had recommended the sentence based on the systematic nature of her crimes and her complete lack of remorse throughout the proceedings. Derek's siblings pressured him to speak at the sentencing hearing on their mother's behalf, arguing that family loyalty required them to present a united front, despite their anger about her manipulation.
"She's still our mother," Amanda argued during a tense family meeting. "Whatever she did, she doesn't deserve to die in prison. Derek, you're her eldest son. Your testimony could influence the judge's decision about her sentence." "No," Derek said firmly, and I felt a surge of pride at his certainty. "She systematically destroyed my wife's business and violated our family's trust for years. She earned this sentence through her own actions, and I won't help her avoid the consequences." It was the first time Derek had prioritized my well-being over his family's expectations, and it marked a fundamental shift in his understanding of where his loyalties belonged. The sentencing hearing itself was a surreal experience. Vivienne appeared in court wearing an orange jumpsuit, her carefully maintained appearance now reduced to the basic uniformity of institutional clothing. Gone was the imperious woman who had commanded respect through intimidation and social positioning. In her place was someone who looked smaller, older, and finally forced to face the reality of her situation. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Vivienne delivered a statement that revealed she still hadn't grasped the true nature of her crimes. "Your Honor, I acted out of concern for my family," she said, reading from prepared remarks that her defense attorney had clearly struggled to make sound genuinely remorseful. "I never intended to cause harm to anyone. I was simply trying to protect my son's interests and help my daughter-in-law understand her responsibilities as a member of our family." Even facing prison time, she couldn't acknowledge that her actions were motivated by control and manipulation rather than family protection. The federal judge's response was swift and unambiguous. "Mrs. Ashford, the evidence presented in this case shows a pattern of deliberate, systematic interference with legitimate business relationships. You used sophisticated methods to gather intelligence, spread false information, and damage your victim's professional reputation. This was not family concern. This was a calculated campaign of harassment that continued for years, despite multiple opportunities to stop." The 18-month sentence felt appropriate, but not particularly satisfying. What mattered more was the broader recognition that Vivienne's behavior had been criminal rather than merely difficult family dynamics. The legal system had validated what I'd known for years. Her treatment of me constituted abuse, not tough love or traditional family expectations. More challenging than Derek's adjustment was watching his siblings navigate their newfound freedom from their mother's control. Jonathan, Amanda, and even the extended family members had to learn how to make decisions, resolve conflicts, and maintain relationships without Vivienne's mediation and manipulation. The first major test came when the family had to decide what to do about their traditional holiday gatherings. For decades, Vivienne had orchestrated every detail of family celebrations, from the menu to the guest list to the conversation topics. Without her controlling presence, they were unsure how to maintain family connections. "Maybe we should skip Christmas this year," Amanda suggested during a tentative family planning call. "It won't feel right without Mother, and I'm not sure any of us knows how to host the way she did." That's exactly why we need to have Christmas, I interjected, surprising myself with my desire to maintain family traditions despite everything that had happened. But we'll do it differently. We'll create new traditions that aren't based on one person controlling every aspect of the celebration. The Christmas celebration we organized that year was smaller, less formal, and infinitely more genuine than any holiday gathering I'd experienced during my marriage. Without Vivienne's need to impress social contacts or maintain appearances, the family was able to focus on actually enjoying each other's company. Derek cooked the turkey using a recipe he found online, rather than following his mother's elaborate traditional preparation. Amanda brought games that encouraged conversation and laughter, rather than the stilted formal discussions that had characterized previous gatherings. Jonathan's children were allowed to be themselves rather than performing for their grandmother's approval. This feels like a real family, Patricia observed, as we sat around the more casual table arrangement we'd chosen instead of Vivienne's intimidating formal dining setup. People are actually talking to each other instead of performing for an audience. But the most significant change was in how the family handled disagreements and conflicts. Previously, Vivienne had served as the ultimate arbiter of family disputes, making decisions that others were expected to accept regardless of their feelings. Without her presence, family members had to learn to negotiate directly with each other, compromise, and respect differing opinions. When Jonathan and Amanda disagreed about how to handle their father's care as his health declined, they worked through their concerns together, rather than appealing to their mother for a definitive ruling. When Derek and I had different ideas about how to spend our vacation time, we discussed our preferences openly, rather than allowing family pressure to dictate our choices. "We're learning to be adults," Derek observed 6 months after his mother's sentencing. "It sounds ridiculous, but I'm 34 years old, and I'm just now learning to have opinions that aren't influenced by someone else's expectations."
The process wasn't always smooth. There were moments when the absence of Vivienne's authoritative decision-making left the family paralyzed by indecision. There were times when old patterns of seeking external validation resurfaced, and family members would look to me or to Derek to fill the vacuum left by their mother's absence. But gradually, the family developed healthier ways of relating to each other. Decisions were made collaboratively rather than imposed from above. Conflicts were resolved through discussion rather than manipulation. Individual achievements were celebrated rather than viewed as threats to family hierarchy. Most importantly, Derek's commitment to supporting me remained consistent, even when it would have been easier to retreat into old patterns of family harmony. When business associates made comments about the scandal, he defended my actions. When former family friends implied that I had been vindictive in pursuing legal action, he corrected their understanding of what his mother had actually done. "Cassandra saved our family," he told his Uncle William during a conversation I overheard at a family gathering 9 months after the trial. "She forced us to confront behavior that was destroying all of us. Yes, the publicity was embarrassing, but the alternative was continuing to enable someone who was systematically abusing people we claimed to love." The proving ground had tested everyone's commitment to change, and most of the family had passed. They were learning to function without toxic control, to support each other without enabling destructive behavior, and to maintain family bonds based on genuine affection rather than fear and obligation. 18 months after Vivienne's sentencing, I stood once again in the marble hallway of the Riverside County Courthouse, but this time for a very different reason. Derek and I were finalizing our divorce, not because our marriage had failed, but because we wanted to start fresh with a relationship built on the foundation of who we truly were, rather than who we'd been forced to become under his mother's manipulation. "It seems strange to end a marriage in order to save it," Derek said as we waited for our attorney to finish the paperwork, "but I understand why we need to do this." The decision to divorce and remarry had come during our couples therapy when Dr. Brennan helped us realize that our original marriage had been compromised from the beginning by Vivienne's interference. Derek had proposed under pressure from his mother, chosen the ring she selected, planned a wedding she controlled, and entered into a union where her expectations overshadowed our actual compatibility. "You've never had the opportunity to choose each other freely," Dr. Brennan had explained. Your marriage began with 3 people in it, and until you create space for just the 2 of you to decide whether you actually want to be together, you'll always be wondering whether your relationship is genuine or just another product of family manipulation. The divorce process had been surprisingly healing. For the first time, Derek and I were able to discuss our relationship without the weight of family expectations, legal entanglements, or social obligations. We could focus entirely on whether we enjoyed each other's company, shared compatible values, and wanted to build a future together. What we discovered was that beneath all the dysfunction and manipulation, we genuinely cared for each other and wanted to make our relationship work. But we also realized that the people we'd become during 3 years of psychological warfare weren't the people we wanted to be going forward. I want to marry the woman who saved my family from my mother's abuse, Derek had told me during one of our discussions about the future, not the woman who felt obligated to conform to my family's expectations. And I want you to marry the man I'm becoming, not the man who failed to protect you when you needed him most. The civil litigation against Vivienne had concluded with a substantial financial settlement that more than compensated for the business losses her sabotage had caused. But more importantly, the legal victory had restored my professional reputation and positioned Meridian Tech Solutions for unprecedented growth. Without the constant interference and undermining, my business relationships flourished. Clients who had been influenced by Vivienne's false concerns discovered that my company delivered exceptional results when not hampered by manufactured crises and reputation attacks. The government contracts that had been jeopardized by her interference were renewed with expanded scope and increased confidence in my team's capabilities. The Meridian Tech story became a case study in business resilience, my business partner Rebecca observed during our quarterly review meeting. You proved that a well-run company can survive and thrive even when subjected to systematic sabotage. That kind of strength and integrity is exactly what clients want in a cybersecurity partner. The company had grown to 300 employees and $85 million in annual revenue, making it one of the most successful cybersecurity firms in New England. More importantly, the culture I'd built emphasized transparency, ethical conduct, and mutual respect, values that stood in stark contrast to the manipulation and control that had characterized my personal life during the Vivienne years.
But the most significant transformation was in my relationship with Derek's family. With Vivienne's toxic influence removed, the siblings had developed genuine affection and respect for each other. They'd learned to celebrate individual successes rather than viewing them as threats to family hierarchy. When Amanda adopted her daughter after years of fertility struggles, the family celebration was joyous and uncomplicated. When Jonathan received a promotion that required relocating to Seattle, everyone supported his decision without questioning whether it was appropriate for family unity. When Derek and I announced our plans to remarry, the response was enthusiastic and genuine. "You gave us back our brother," Amanda told me during our remarriage celebration planning. "The Derek we knew as children, before Mother trained him to be afraid of disappointing her. You helped him remember who he really was underneath all that conditioning." The remarriage ceremony took place in our backyard, officiated by a friend rather than a family connection, with a guest list that reflected our actual relationships rather than social obligations. Derek designed the ring himself, a simple, elegant band that represented our choice to commit to each other without family pressure or manipulation. "This time I choose you," he said during the vows we'd written together. "Not because it's expected or because it maintains family peace, but because I love who you are and I want to build a life based on mutual respect and genuine partnership." My own vows reflected the journey we'd both taken to reach this moment. I choose to marry the man you've become, not the man you were forced to be. I choose to build a relationship based on truth rather than obligation, on support rather than control, on love rather than fear. The celebration that followed was everything our original wedding hadn't been: intimate,
genuine, and focused entirely on Derek and me, rather than on meeting family expectations or impressing social contacts. We danced to music we'd chosen, ate food we actually enjoyed, and spent time with people who genuinely cared about our happiness rather than their own social positioning. 6 months after our remarriage, Vivienne was released from federal prison to begin her supervised probation. The conditions of her release included a restraining order that prohibited any contact with me or my business associates. But I no longer felt threatened by her potential interference. The woman who emerged from prison was a shadow of the commanding matriarch who once controlled her family through intimidation and manipulation. 18 months of institutional life had broken her sense of entitlement and forced her to confront the reality that her actions had consequences she couldn't manipulate away. Derek visited her once after her release, a meeting that lasted less than an hour, and confirmed that she remained unrepentant about her treatment of me. She blamed her imprisonment on my vindictiveness rather than her own criminal behavior, and she made it clear that she expected her family to choose between supporting her and maintaining relationships with me. She's still trying to force people to choose sides, Derek told me after that final meeting. But the difference is that now everyone understands what she really is. She has no power over any of us anymore. The family's response to Vivienne's attempted manipulation was swift and decisive. None of Derek's siblings were willing to sacrifice their own healing or their relationships with their spouses and children to placate her mother's need for control. She found herself genuinely isolated for the first time in her life, facing the consequences of decades of abusive behavior. "Sometimes I feel sorry for her," Derek admitted during one of our evening walks around our neighborhood. "She's alone and bitter and unable to understand why her own family won't enable her anymore. But then I remember what she did to you, to all of us, and I realize that loneliness is the natural consequence of treating people as objects to be controlled rather than humans deserving of respect." Today, 3 years after that confrontation in the courthouse hallway, I wear my simple remarriage ring with pride and gratitude. It represents everything I'd learned about love, boundaries, and the courage required to demand better treatment from people who claim to care about you. Meridian Tech Solutions continues to thrive, now recognized as a leader in corporate cybersecurity with a reputation built on integrity and excellence rather than family connections or social positioning. My team respects me for my professional competence and ethical leadership, not because they're afraid of disappointing me or losing my approval. Derek has become the man I always hoped he could be: independent, supportive, and genuinely committed to our partnership rather than maintaining family peace at any cost. He's learned to set boundaries with toxic people, to prioritize our relationship over social expectations, and to take responsibility for protecting what we've built together. The Ashford family gatherings are smaller now, but infinitely more genuine. Conversations focus on real connection rather than performance. Conflicts are resolved through honest discussion rather than manipulation. Individual achievements are celebrated rather than seen as threats to family unity. Most importantly, I've learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enablement. That demanding respect isn't cruel, it's necessary. That some relationships are worth fighting for, but only if both people are willing to do the work required to make them healthy. The naive woman who believed that family loyalty required accepting unacceptable behavior is gone forever. In her place is someone who understands that the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in your own diminishment, even when that refusal comes at a significant cost. Standing in my office today, looking out at the city where I've built a life based on my own values and choices, I feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because I destroyed Vivienne Ashford, but because I refused to let her destroy me. The ring on my finger represents a choice made freely, a commitment based on genuine love rather than social obligation. and a relationship built on the foundation of mutual respect rather than systematic control. The woman who once demanded my wedding ring in a courthouse hallway 3 years ago had no power over me anymore. The woman wearing the ring I'd chosen for myself was someone she could never diminish, control, or manipulate again. And that transformation, from victim to victor, from controlled to empowered, from diminished to dignified, was worth every battle I'd fought to achieve it. The security detail that had stepped forward in that courthouse hallway 3 years ago had been more than professional protection. They had been symbols of the resources, determination, and strategic thinking I'd developed to protect everything I'd worked to build. Today, I was my own security detail, strong enough to defend what mattered most and wise enough to recognize threats before they could cause irreparable damage. The story that began with humiliation and control had ended with dignity and choice, and that, I realized, was the most satisfying victory of all.